Right now, off the coast of British Columbia, families are having conversations we can't fully understand. They're not speaking with words, but with clicks, whistles, and calls so complex that each pod has its own dialect passed down for generations. These are the northern resident killer whales, and their language might be one of the most sophisticated communication systems in the ocean. In a world with rising noise pollution, understanding how much this language matters to their culture, their social structure, and even their survival has never been more important. Because for over 50 years, scientists studying these whales in the Pacific Northwest have been uncovering something remarkable. These aren't just sounds, they're learned, they're shared, and they're unique to each family. The Pacific Northwest has three ecotypes of orcas: residents, bigs, and offshores. Of the resident ecotypes in the region, there are the northern residents, there are the southern residents, southern Alaskan residents, and even a further population in the west of Alaska. Of these various populations, the northern and southern residents are perhaps the most well-known orcas in the world. Between these two populations, the framework of worldwide orca research has been set by some legendary marine mammal researchers, including the likes of John Ford, Michael Bigg, Paul Spong, and Kenneth Malcolm. So this video is going to be about the northern residents, and we're going to be exploring who they are, how they hunt, and also doing a very deep dive into the world of orca acoustics and how these acoustics within orcas shape their culture, shape their family structure, and shape so much of their lives. Every media source within this video will be credited on screen, and then, with the exception of Whale Talk's own media, we'll be assigning a number where you can go and look through the description to find the full credits of the source associated with that number. Of course, this kind of video on this topic is not possible to make without giving a massive mention to Orca Lab. Orca Lab are a pioneer in non-interference based research and have been studying these orcas for over 50 years. Since I first started getting really interested in whales and dolphins, I've known of Orca Lab, and I hold them in extremely high regard. So it was an amazing pleasure to be given permission by Orca Lab to use parts of their highlight reel from their live stream cameras during this video. So to explain where this footage that you'll be seeing that's credited to Orca Lab is coming from, Orca Lab uses remote cameras and hydrophones to study these orca. They prefer a non-interference style of research. And we are very fortunate that through Orca Lab's partnership with explore.org, we also get the chance to experience this from anywhere in the world. I will leave links to the webcams in the description. These are available on YouTube. During the months of July and September, these webcams are such a joy to watch, and often other viewers who are watching will give you timestamps for when the whales are on the cameras as well, which is quite frequently during those summer months. When looking at the history of populations of orcas in the Northwest Pacific, I always find it's easiest to just draw a line at a particular point, which is modern history, and this is the end of the live capture era. The northern residents were impacted by the live capture era in the 60s and early 70s. These were also the same captures that decimated the southern resident population and also heavily impacted the bigs population as well. However, since then, the northern residents have really shown a comeback in contrast to their southern counterparts. Currently, there is only one remaining northern resident orca in captivity, called Corky, who would have been known as A16, part of A5 pod. Her story is extremely tragic. and even more so when you understand the social bonds between orcas and their families. She has been captive for 57 years. Corky also has a brother, scientifically known as A60, but also commonly known as Fife, and she has never met her brother. Now, a quick side note here is that you guys know I raise money for WDC. I wear and dolphin conservation. Heck, I'm even wearing one of their t-shirts right now. They have an orca adoption program which collaborates with Orca Lab. Now, A65 is one of the 4 orcas you can adopt through this program. Now, when I found out that WDC and Orca Lab collaborate on this adoption, particularly for this video, I couldn't help but bring attention to it, because this is raising money for WDC, which is a charity that I raise money for quite frequently anyway, and it's also helping out Orca Lab, who are very, very important in the research of these northern residents. So I will leave links in the description to the adoption page, and on there are 4 orcas that you could adopt through WDC and Orca Lab. Those being A65, A72 Bend, and A72 Bend has a very interesting dorsal fin. It's got like a nick at the front of the dorsal fin, very iconic. There's A42 Holly, now not to be confused with our channel mascot, who is also called Holly, but our channel mascot is actually T99B, a big orca. A42 Holly is actually descended from an orca that I read a lot about in Alex Morton's book, that being A9 Eve. And you could also adopt A34 Simum. Simum is a roughly 50-year-old matriarch. So once again, I will leave a link in the description to the adoption page. Adoption for these 4 orcas, once again, benefits both WDC and Orca Lab. So let's start off by talking about one more simpler sides of the northern residents before we get into some of the more complicated stuff such as hunting, social structure, and acoustics. During the summer, typically from July to September, the northern residents frequently areas around the north of Vancouver Island and the waterways between Vancouver Island and mainland British Columbia. Now, outside the summer, their range also then extends to the southeast of Alaska during the winter, and like all orca populations, their habitat is really decided by prey availability. And the northern residents mostly eat salmon. So we need to talk about salmon first. So salmon will spawn in rivers, usually after a few years out at sea. And they'll always come back to the same river that they were born in to spawn. And usually they return en masse to these rivers as well. This is what is referred to as a salmon run, when lots of the same salmon go to the same river and they try and swim upstream to get to the spawning grounds for the baby salmon. The time of the year for the salmon runs differs per species of salmon. So in the Pacific Northwest, you've got several different species of salmon, such as Chinook, sockeye, or chum. This means that during the year there are multiple different salmon runs, and the northern residents have learned these patterns of when these salmon runs will occur. So they make sure they're in the areas at the point where those salmon runs are going to occur, because that means that there's a lot of concentrated food. It's much easier to find food when you know they're going to a certain location all en masse. So this dictates where the northern residents are throughout the year. Another feature of the geography of the area for the northern residents is a very specific, unique behavior that they perform, which is belly rubbing. They find a very few select beaches that have smooth rocks, and they'll just rub against it. Sometimes they'll just do one pass, sometimes they'll be there for hours even. Now this could be a form of skincare, it could just feel good. No one actually really knows for sure why they do this. One such beach where they do this is called Strider Rubbing Beach. Fortunately, Orca Lab have a camera underwater and above water, at these beaches. And it's fascinating to watch these in the summer because you can be watching two cameras at once. You can be watching the one overlooking the water, and then you see them there, look at the underwater because they pass really, really close to the underwater webcam. It's fantastic to watch. So the northern residents also share the same waters as quite a few neighbor cetacean species. One real notable one is Pacific white-sided dolphins, and they've had quite a lot of attention recently because of a collaborative hunting technique, which we're going to cover in the next section quite soon. Also, if you are eagle-eyed enough with the footage I'm going to show in that segment, you may also notice another species. These are Dow's porpoise. They also share the same waterways as orcas and the Pacific white-sided dolphins. The Dow's porpoises are pretty small, but they share some of the coloration patterns to orcas and seem to hang around the Pacific white-sided dolphins quite a bit as well. The northern resident killer whales also share their home with humpback whales and big orcas. Now, the big orcas, they prefer a much quieter lifestyle because the prey that they hunt is much more able to detect them if they're louder. So big orcas will actually often avoid areas with northern residents currently active. Now, there's been a recent study that suggests potential predation in the past of big orcas upon resident orcas, and there's theories going about regarding that, saying that potentially the residents would do a kind of mobbing behavior if the bigs got too close. I'm not going to talk about that in this video. I have my own kind of skepticism regarding that. We can't talk about species that the northern residents share some of their range with without also talking about the southern residents as well. So in theory, the northern and southern residents do have a very small amount of overlap within their ranges. To this date, northern and southern residents who, despite being the same ecotype and feeding on the same prey, have never been witnessed directly interacting with one another. However, interactions between the two are becoming a little bit more likely, with the northern residents range extending a little bit further south each year. Although this does seem to coincide with the southern residents being less frequent in the Salish Sea themselves. So let's talk about the northern residents' prey. So their primary prey is Chinook salmon. This is because Chinook is the biggest species of salmon, which means that they have the most calories, which they're the most fulfilling meal. But they also predate upon other species of salmon as well, and very occasionally, if they can't find salmon, they will eat other fish species. A very fascinating discovery was made in 2025 and published in a paper towards the end of the year. This was a study by the University of British Columbia in collaboration with Dalhousie University, Orcas Institute, and Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research. And this paper was authored by Fortune et al. This is about a cooperative hunting technique employed by the northern resident killer whales and the Pacific white-sided dolphins in the region. Now, I want to quickly take a moment to thank the University of British Columbia for providing me with footage and permission to use that footage from their tag attached cameras, as well as some of the drone footage they used. The tags were attached via suction cups using a pole, and the suction cups were designed to fall off naturally after a certain period of time. These suction cups were pre-corroded. Also a warning, the footage that I show on screen will include some instances of predation. Now, at times, the orcas will team up with Pacific white-sided dolphins to hunt salmon together. During these hunts, the orcas will actually be really quiet. They're almost silent, and they'll be in amongst these dolphins, and they'll be listening. They'll be listening to the echolocation from the dolphins, which is quite a bit more broader than the orcas. And the orcas will share the prey, the salmon, between their pod. And Chinook salmon are large enough for them to prey share. And such an act can be very messy and leaves a lot of chunks of fish in the water. Now, a Chinook salmon is way too big for the Pacific white-sided dolphins to properly hunt, so they're happy to take over those leftover scraps. Now, northern residents and Pacific white-sided dolphins seem to have a bit of a complicated relationship. There are some instances, including a case that we'll be covering a little bit later on about I-76, where the interactions could be interpreted as somewhat antagonistic. However, with the cooperative hunting strategy between them, the interactions do not seem to be antagonistic at all. They do seem to be cooperative. It is also theorized in another paper that was posted last year. The Pacific white-sided dolphins also stick close to northern residents to avoid becoming prey to big orcas. In orcas, acoustics are a huge element of social structure, culture, and could even be a contributing factor to eventual speciation between different ecotypes. The northern residents are perhaps the most studied population in the world for acoustics, and the only other population that comes even close to that are the southern residents. For this reason, we're going to actually take the time in this video to cover orca acoustics from a basic level to more of like a scientific level. And we're going to cover some of the scientific terminology and how calls are denoted. So to begin with, we will look at how toothed whales create sound. Now, we're not going to cover baleen whales because they create sound differently. Also, when speaking about creating sound, do apologize to the birds in the background. They really want to be in the video. So toothed whales have an organ that's called the melon. And this is an organ that sits in front of the brain, right at the front of the head. If you want a visible representation, just imagine a beluga whale. It's that big squishy thing on the front of the head. And this is an organ of connective tissues and fats. Now, to produce a sound, toothed whales will force pressurized air through a small pocket called the phonic lips, which is lined with fatty layers which then vibrate. These vibrations are channeled as if through concave mirrors, and they go through various channels of the melon to produce sound. And that is to say that the melon focuses sound. In orcas, these sounds come in 3 different forms, and these are determined by frequencies and durations of these sounds. Low frequency sounds are sounds that are very low and sound like bass, while high frequency sounds are, as you would imagine, high pitched. And this is an important distinction later on. Now, orcas are the largest species of the oceanic dolphin family Delphinidae, but their vocalations are so much different than other dolphins. I remember reading in Alexandra Morton's autobiography, Listening to Whales. She mentions at one point that she was surprised when she was first hearing orca sounds because normally she would have to slow down the sounds to even be able to record them or to interpret them. But with orca, she didn't, meaning that orca communication is just slower in tempo. The orca's hearing is really good as well. They receive these sounds through the lower jaw mostly. An orca's hearing range is estimated to be around 0.5 to 125 kilohertz, whereas a human's range is 0.2 to 17 kilohertz roughly. Now, when describing these different vocal types, I will display spectrograms on the screen, which for me personally I find very useful to be able to just visualize and understand what these sounds are. So a spectrogram is a graph with sound frequency on the left, time on the bottom. So the higher on the graph, the higher pitch, the lower on the graph, the lower pitch. Now, the simplest sounds that orcas make to understand is clicks. So these clicks are used not for communication but for echolocation. Echolocation is basically a whale sonar. So the way echolocation works is that the orca sends out a click and it moves in a wave forwards. And it should be noted that sound in seawater travels around 1,500 meters per second, which is over 4 times quicker than in air. This sound wave travels through the water until it connects with something solid. This could be the seafloor, a rock, or hopefully for a northern resident orca, a nice big tasty juicy salmon. Now when this sound wave hits something, such as a salmon, the sound wave will then be reflected back towards the orca, and the orca will hear the echo of the click, and it will know that there's something there. Now, it is likely that they have such a mastery of the soundscape of the water that they know roughly how far away the Chinook is and its size, based on the echo of the click, but this is speculation on my part. The key thing is that this allows them to find prey that they wouldn't be able to see yet, because water is murky, visibility in water is very low. Sound is not limited by how murky the water is. Now, the second form of sound that an orca makes are single-tone sounds called whistles. They do not have any resonance and are theorized to be for social and communication purposes. These are rarer than the next call we're going to be talking about, which is the majority of the calls that orcas make. So the final classification of vocal sound that orcas produce are called pulsed calls. These are likely the ones that you've heard the most when you hear whale song. They are produced at a range of frequencies, and the tonal pitch changes throughout the call. These calls are learnt from an orca's family, who have a handful of distinct calls that are unique to their matroline. Now, to just clarify what I just said there, when I refer to unique to the matroline, I'm referring to the ensemble of calls that they have, the repertoire of calls that they have, not the calls themselves, because the calls are used by multiple different matchlines, but each matchline uses the same set of calls that are unique to that matchline. The full repertoire of calls is sometimes referred to as the dialect. Now, furthermore, Ford in 1989 described 3 different classifications of pulse calls. These are discrete calls, which are repetitive and which are very easy to identify. Variable calls are non-repetitive and are much more difficult to categorize. And finally, aberrant calls are highly modified versions of discrete calls. So you may think that this sounds quite complicated. So did the scientists. And in 1987, John Ford published a catalogue which outlined a new system for notation for these calls. This is a publication that is still used today as the backbone of Acoustic studies. Now, I should say, for my research for this video, there were 2 papers that I looked at, not just one. So I looked at John Ford 1987 and also John Ford 1989. Now, if we treat Michael Bigg as the foundation of photo ID, then John Ford is the foundation of Acoustic studies. So I will link both of these papers in the description. Personally, I found the 1989 paper easier to learn Acoustics from than the 1987. That being said, the 1987 paper is what laid the groundwork to the notation system. Now, this notation system is alphanumeric. So the calls from the northern residents are given an N to begin with, and then an ascending number for each different call. Now, pulse calls can still be varied, even if it's the same call. This is why sometimes you'll see a Roman numeral after it. So you'll see like N1, 1 or N1, 2. This is the same call, N1, but it's different, slight variations of that call. But this is only done when it's consistently the case. I will show a few examples on screen with some example pods that use certain calls. Now, the information I show on screen is information that I have gotten from, say, Orca. Now, this is an app that Orca Lab have collaborated on, but what I'm showing on screen is not a complete catalogue. These are just to demonstrate a few examples. Now, if, like me, you enjoy watching and hearing these orcas during the summer on Orca Lab's live cams, or want to learn more about specific northern resident calls, particularly with specific pods, Orca Lab have an extremely good app called Say Orca. I have the app here. So these have example calls of the pods and the clans. So you can see here the clans. So if I pick A, you can then see the pods and the different calls that they do. And then if I were to click here, you on A4 pod, you get to see all the different calls that they have. And then you can listen. You can play one and then listen and compare to what you're hearing on the cams and the hydrophones. So we'll explain the difference between pods and clans in a little bit. Now these calls on Say Orca also have spectrograms to help you be able to understand the structure of the call and what you're listening out for, because sometimes it can be easier to hear something go up and then down and then up. I can't stress how incredible it is that this app exists, because over 50 years, Orca Lab have been able to identify which pods use exactly which calls, and even when multiple pods share some but not all calls, they're able to identify which pod uses which calls. Now finally, there is one other audible way that orcas can communicate or at least interact with their environment. Now these are not sounds that they produce with the melon. These are what are referred to as percussive sounds. So percussive sounds are like a tail slap, or like a pectoral flipper slap, or even a breach. And these all make loud noises upon the water. Now, not much is known as to the reason or context of this. This could be a form of signaling to pod members without actually vocalizing. This could even be a form of communication to their prey, a source of causing panic, or to try and, when they're hunting fish, to herd the fish into like a bait ball, like we see in Norway. But ultimately, we don't really know the reason for this. Now, there could also be multiple contexts behind this, because no way of knowing if these actions always mean the same thing. And it could even be that in cases like breaching, that it might just be incidental, where producing the sound isn't the intent of the behavior. They might just be breaching because they want to be breaching, not because they want to make the big splash noise. Now, let's look at social structure. And when we look at social structure, as always, we have to first look at how these researchers can ID these whales. So these whales are photo ID'd from the left side dorsal and the saddle patch. These have to be perpendicular under certain lighting conditions, and both the dorsal fin and saddle patch have to be visible for it to be a photo for an ID, as these have to be the cleanest images. Now, one important but lesser known identifying feature for photo identification is that northern residents sometimes have what is referred to as an open saddle patch. Now, the saddle patch is the grey section behind the dorsal fin, and an open saddle patch means that it is not solid grey, but is instead interrupted with black coloration. The best example that I can think of is actually Springer, which I'll be showing on screen right now. And alongside her is a big Orca, T99B Holly. So you can see Holly's got a closed saddle patch, where Springer has an open saddle patch. With big orcas, they pretty much all have closed saddle patches, but with resident orcas, they tend to have a mix of closed and open saddle patches. It does not appear yet that researchers of the northern residents are using eye patches for photo ID. However, in the southern residents, for instance, they do use eye patches now, and also with the bigs. But with the northern residents, it seems to just be the dorsal fin, the left side dorsal fin, and the saddle patch for the time being. Now, there is a photo ID catalog, but as far as I can find, there is no photo ID catalog past 2020. There's actually a good reason for this. In most cases, it's really, really important to have a photo ID catalogue to be able to identify which orca is which and to be able to track lineage. However, there is a big flaw with a photo ID catalogue, and that is that it can be outdated. The second that there's a birth, or a whale goes missing, or a whale dies, the photo ID catalogue is out of date. Heck, even an orca having a little bit of an incident where they have like a little notch taken out of their dorsal fin, or gain another identifying mark, makes a photo ID catalogue that's on paper, that's published, and once it's published, can't be like changed. It makes that out of date. Usually, researchers have to go by a photo ID catalogue because that's basically the best they're gonna get. But the northern residents are studied so extensively, photographed so frequently, and honestly, this could even be the case for the southern residents and the bigs as well, where bacytology specifically seem to be driving a shift away from paper-based photo ID catalogues, and they're basically using technology to advance the photo ID. They have an app for the northern resident killer whales for IDing purposes. It's called NRKW ID. I actually have it on my phone, and this is publicly available. Now, the advantage of this is that it can be immediately updated. It's an app, so it can be immediately updated. And so therefore it's never out of date like a paper catalog would be. And Bacytology are also working on something else called Finwave, which is a photo IDing web-based platform, which uses some more recent technology advances such as artificial intelligence. However, it should be said that it's the scientists that then confirm whether the AI's got it right or not. We actually use Finwave for some of our science data for Orca Watch, specifically for the big orcas. We have a large list of matrilines, and quite a lot of that data comes from Finwave. Now let's look at the IDing system for the northern resident killer whales. So they have an incremental alphanumeric designation. So the IDs for northern residents are assigned incrementally, and the mothers, the birth years, and the genders, when known, are logged. The letter on the ID is assigned based on the maternal pod. So acoustics play a big part in the social structure of these killer whales, and also how we categorize that social structure. Orcas have to learn their family's calls. They are not known from birth. So because of this, we can tell that pods or matrilines that have similar calls are more closely related than ones that have completely different calls. So one advantage of this is that between different matrilines of orcas, the more distant they sound to each other, the less likely they are to be related. And it's theorized that orcas will choose their mates based on how different they sound, because that means that they're less likely to be related. However, there is a problem with this because orca fathers don't stick around, and an orca's language, so to speak, is entirely learned. And this mostly comes from their mother and the rest of their family unit. So the core repertoire of orcas comes entirely from the mother's side. Now, the northern residents are split into 3 different categorized groups. These are referred to as matrilines, pods, and clans. So what you'll see on screen right now is a quick diagram that I made based on information from NRKW ID, which is the photo ID app by Bacytology. So a matriline is a mother orca and her immediate non-dispersed offspring, and any offspring of her non-dispersed daughters. Now, dispersal is a term referring to when an orca will start traveling separate from its mother or from its matriline. And this most frequently happens with adult females when they start having their own offspring. Usually dispersed offspring end up rejoining with their mother temporarily, but quite frequently. It's like if you decided to move out of your parents' home and you decided to buy a house like on the same street. Like you're going to run into each other every so often. Now, a matriline is almost always found traveling together, and the members of a matrilineare the closest acoustically to one another, and they use the same repertoire of sounds. So a matriline is named after the actual mother of the matriline. So for instance, the A23s is named after A23. And now the A23s are still referred to as the A23s, despite the fact that A23 is deceased. And the reason for this is that her two remaining wild offspring, A43 and A60, are both still traveling together in that matriline. And A43's calf and then her calves are still traveling together in the 3-generation unit. But they're still called the A23s because A60 is still traveling with them. So A43 has a granddaughter, A109, and when eventually A109 starts having her own calves and maybe disperses, that will then make the A109s a matriline. The next classification is a pod. Now, a pod is made up of closely related matrilines, for example, sisters or daughters, who have their own offspring and their own matriline. Pods are quite often seen traveling together, but not all the time. Now, you may notice some of these pods have different lettered prefixes than the next categorization, which is acoustic clans. We'll talk about acoustic clans in a second, but I just want to mention, because it could be a little bit confusing, why we have C1 pod, D1 pod, for instance, or even the fact that we have multiple pods called I and no other categorization. So this is based on a historical categorization that is no longer used, but those names have continued to stick. So these prefixes are outdated, but to make it easier to not have to recategorize everything, they are still referred to as what they were referred to before. So C1, and then the matrilines under C1 are also C matrilines. For the prefixes for these pods, you really don't need to know about them. The important thing is the actual pods themselves and the acoustic clans. The final categorization are acoustic clans, also referred to as clans. So a clan is a group of pods that do not share any calls with the other clans. So a clan, all of these share calls with each other, but they don't share any calls with any of the pods from G clan or R clan. So there are 3 clans, A, G, and R, and most of the pods belong to A clan, with a few in G clan and only a single pod in R clan. Although R1 pod is a very large pod, almost akin to maybe a southern resident pod in terms of size. However, it's also important to note that different pods from different clans do still interact with one another and seem to at least be able to communicate, even though they speak different languages entirely. Due to how well studied these orcas are, we are also afforded an incredible insight into the strength of the social bonds between them. Orcas have an emotional and social intelligence that, quite frankly, far outstrips what humans are capable of truly understanding. Biologically, the part of the brain that processes complex emotions and social experience is much larger than in the human brain. And this is also an extremely important argument against the captivity of orcas, because an animal that can potentially feel more than we can, who has stronger experiences than we do, stripping them away from something as important to them as their family and keeping them captive is just frankly cruel. Now, evidence of this strong bond was made even clearer during last summer. Now, on the channel, I do a video series called Orca Watch, where we look at various orcas for a particular month. And during the summer months, we look at the northern residents as well. Whilst following updates for this video series last summer, we unfortunately discovered of the death of a northern resident called I-76, which was witnessed by researchers. And I-76 was extremely emaciated at the time. This was a 28-year-old male orca. What was really unique about this is that it was physically witnessed by researchers, although I really don't envy the researchers actually being present to witness that. I can imagine it would take a toll on a researcher to see one of the animals that you study all the time, like, passing away. But the reason why I bring this up in this video is the focus on I-76's family. From testimonials of the researchers, particularly Jared Towers of Basicology, I-4, who is I-76's mother, travelled at an incredible speed to rejoin with her poorly eldest son, I-76, while Pacific white-sided dolphins were likely stressing him because they were hanging around. Now, what followed the death was very clearly different behavior from the pod that could even be associated with the period of mourning. Now, as scientists or citizen scientists, we should always be careful not to anthropomorphize too much, but I think in this instance there can't really be much of a grey area of understanding that the orcas, the way they're acting after this event, was a sign of mourning. Whether it be mourning in their own way or mourning in a way that we understand a little bit more ourselves. Now, this whole event was covered in detail by Acoustic and Towers in 2025, and I will leave a link to the paper below. While this population's numbers have significantly improved since the capture era, it still faces several threats. And these threats are similar to the southern residents, albeit quite likely that they are at different intensities. Food availability is still a threat, with some rivers that salmon would traditionally spawn in being blocked by dams. However, it does not affect the northern residents as much as it affects the southern residents, mostly because the salmon that comes to the southern residents have to go through the range of the northern residents to get there. That being said, more salmon means more salmon for everyone. More salmon for the northern residents, more salmon for the southern residents, even more salmon for recreational fishermen. So really, the propagation of more salmon is always going to be a good thing in this area for everyone involved. Another threat that these orcas face are chemical pollutants. These can affect orcas directly, such as in the case of oil spills, but it can also affect them via biomagnification. Now, biomagnification is when contaminants start at a lower level in the food chain, at a lower trophic level, which is a scientific term. So let's say it starts in small fish. These small fish then get eaten by bigger fish. So these bigger fish will have more contaminants because they eat more of these contaminated smaller fish. So it will build up. And then let's say the orcas will eat these bigger fish. So let's say the bigger fish are salmon. The orcas will eat more salmon, and they'll be absorbing all the contaminants associated with not just the salmon, but also the salmon's prey as well. And you have to remember, these fish are migratory as well. They could be traveling from other places that are polluted, whereas the orcas might not be living in an environment that is heavily polluted with contaminants, but their food might be coming from somewhere that is. So when we think of conservation, we can't just think of the range where the orcas live. We have to think of the whole ecosystem as a whole. We have to think of where does their prey go and what is their prey subjected to. Now, orcas are also subjected to bioaccumulation. Now, it's important to make a distinction between biomagnification and bioaccumulation. Biomagnification is based on what eats what. And so biomagnification will go up through the food chain. Bioaccumulation, however, is specific to a particular individual. So bioaccumulation is when an individual over a long period of time keeps eating this contaminated fish, the toxin levels will eventually build up. Now, these toxins in male orcas particularly have nowhere to go, and can even be a cause of shortened lifespan within male orcas. Female orcas, however, do have one way to expel these toxins, through the milk. But this also means that it massively increases the fatality rate of firstborn calves among any orcas that are subject to both biomagnification and bioaccumulation. And the reason why this affects the firstborn calves is because this is after 15 years of the mother building up these toxins. Now, both of these concepts are not mutually exclusive. Most of the time they happen in combination with each other. And this is bad news for an apex predator, such as an orca, because they accumulate most of the toxins from the entire food chain. Now, it's important to remember that diet is important here. So they will not gain the buildup that are in the pinnipeds of the cetaceans. And orcas will build up these toxins throughout their entire life. And some chemicals can even attack reproductive systems, such as crude oil from oil spills. There is actually a stock of transient orcas who are functionally extinct now. And this is not because they have all died out from the Exxon Valdez oil spill, but because it left a lasting impact, lasting damage that damaged the reproductive systems of the orcas in that stock. And this prevented them being able to reproduce since that oil spill. And as a result, they are now functionally extinct because all the females that still exist are post-reproductive. Functional extinct means that they will go extinct and there is nothing we can do about it. This is not due to lack of action, this is a biological impossibility that they can recover. The most frequent case of this is when a species becomes so low in numbers that one of their genders died out completely. Now, orcas, along with all marine animals, are at risk of physical pollution too. Particularly with larger animals, this isn't things like bottle caps or things like that. This is more to do with fishing gear, particularly ropes and cables from fishing nets. Now, while it seems orcas are slightly better avoiding entanglements than some of their other cetacean neighbors, such as humpback whales who get entangled quite easily, it's always still a risk. And a risk that, in my opinion, doesn't get enough attention in some places in the world. Now, lastly, let's talk about boats. Over the years, there have been some pretty nasty boat strikes on orcas. A60 Fife of the A23s, who we've been showing periodically through this video. He's also one of the orcas you can adopt with WDC. He was at one point in his life subjected to a very nasty boat strike, which has actually left the iconic marks on his dorsal fin. Now, there are two causes of boat strikes. The first cause is when boat captains are unaware that there are whales and dolphins in the area. This is when communication between boats is very important to inform other boat captains that there are whales in the area. I know in the Salish Sea they put up a white flag with a tail fluke on it, which symbolizes that there are whales in the area. I'm not sure if this is also the case in the Northern Residence Range. The second cause is recklessness, of people getting too close or going too fast near the cetaceans. And for this is where regulation really matters. But it needs to be regulation that is frequently enforced so that it can act as a deterrent. The other thing with boats is that they create a lot of noise, and noise pollution is pretty harmful towards orcas and cetaceans as a whole. When you listen to a hydrophone and you hear a boat that's very loud, it's annoying, but you can turn off your sound if it's too loud. Orcas, however, cannot. And sometimes it even sounds like, from their calls, that they are, for want of a better word, trying to shout over the boat noise. But this noise pollution has an even bigger impact than just mere irritation towards the orcas. You may remember earlier we talked about orcas being very quiet when they're hunting with dolphins, so that they can eavesdrop on the echolocation of the dolphins. Now, the fact that they do this shows that they need less outside noise to be able to hear the echolocation clearly. So if you take this finding and add boat noise as a factor when orcas are hunting on their own, you'll quickly see how boat noise can hamper the orca's ability to successfully find their prey. Now, finally, I want to finish off this video by talking about a very heartwarming story. Probably my favorite orca story of all time. On screen, you'll see an image of A73. A73 is a 26-year-old female orca, a northern resident. A73 is part of A4 pod and also part of A24 matrilineage. She is a 26-year-old female orca and she's got two calves. Those calves are 13-year-old A104 and 9-year-old A116. A73's story brings together pretty much all of the aspects that I've talked about in this video. A73 is well known by a different name. She's one of the most famous wild orcas. She is also known by the name Springer. In January 2022, this young female orca, who was about 2 years old, the equivalent to a human toddler, was found in the Puget Sound, and she was very unwell, in extremely poor health, and seemingly completely on her own. And she was very strongly associating with boats. I should quickly note for you that this happened a few years before Luna, which was a southern resident that got very attached to boats. So based on photo ID guides and her vocal calls, scientists were able to work out that this was the daughter of A45. A45 was never seen again and is presumed to have died. She and A73 went missing both at the same time. So it is suspected that A45 died, and that's why Springer was left completely on her own, orphaned. And because of the acoustic studies and the photo ID catalogue, they were able to work out who Springer's closest living relatives were. And this is the only time in human history to this point that scientists have been able to pinpoint exactly who a wayward orca's family is and successfully be able to reintegrate her back into her family. This is a massive show of how robust the research is around these orcas, both acoustically and with photo ID, and understanding the social structure with these orcas. Without the amazing work by the researchers prior to 2000, Springer would not be alive right now, or she would be in a marine park. But instead, currently she swims free with two offspring with her pod when she's not out on her own with her offspring. So having worked out who Springer was, she was carefully taken into a sea pen for a short period of time, where she was nursed back to health, and with a huge emphasis with the rescuers on having the absolute minimal human contact possible so that she doesn't get used to people. She was then transported all the way back to another sea pen in Johnstone Strait. Very soon after that, her extended family swam by, the exact family that the researchers was hoping would swim by, and Springer was released to go and join them after having vocalized with them. While she didn't integrate immediately with her extended family, she was eventually adopted by a young adult female from A5 pod known as A51 nodalis. Now, distinction, Springer is from A4 pod, not A5 pod, so this is a little bit different. And in fact, A24, the matriline which she is part of right now, A24 herself would have been her grandmother. Now, A51 nodalis was already caring for her younger brother after their mother passed away. So A51's first lesson to Springer was actually to steer her away from interacting with birds. And this was observed. This is fascinating because this means that the capacity to which orcas teach their offspring, and even in this case, surrogate offspring, is very reactive. Eventually, Springer rejoined her family pod, the A4s. Now, fast forward to now, A73 Springer travels with her own two calves and the matriline of her relatives. And this would not have been possible at all if we did not understand the acoustics of these orcas and the familial connections between acoustically similar orcas. And also on a side note, I would say Springer is the only orca that I would personally be able to tell apart entirely off the saddle patch alone. Look, her saddle patch is very, very iconic. Just have a look at it. So I want to thank everyone so much for watching this video. I want to say a massive shout out to Orca for allowing me to use their footage, the University of British Columbia for permitting me use of some of the camera footage during their paper from December, and also Whale and Dolphin Conservation, aka WDC, for helping me out with some copyright related stuff whilst making this video. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you want to see more videos like this, we don't do them that often. These take several months to make, so leave a subscribe. You'll see when we have more orca videos for you. In the meantime, we do a podcast every month. We also do Orca Watch, which is based mostly on the Salish Sea, but we do include the northern residents in the summer. We also do a whale news video once a month as well. And if you truly want to support, we'll leave a link to the WDC adoptions in the description. We'll also leave a link to the Orca Lab website where you can also donate directly to them as well. Donating towards these charities and research institutes allow them to continue the amazing work that they do on behalf of whales and dolphins. So if you want to support Whale Talk Podcast, support them instead. Thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you next time.